Okay, so like imagine you're scrolling through TikTok, right? And like everyone's life looks perfect, vacations, new clothes, hanging with friends, and you're just kind of like sitting there
Duh.
feeling it. But we've all been there, right?
Yeah.
It's just so easy to get caught up in comparing yourself to others online. But what if I told you there's a way to actually like feel more in control, even with all the craziness online? Today we're going on a deep dive into
For emotional superpower.
your emotional superpower, not like some mystical force,
Yeah.
but like actually understanding your emotions.
That's such a good point. We're constantly being stimulated, and it's so easy to just let our emotions run on autopilot. But when we take the time to really try and understand what we're feeling and why it's like unlocking this whole new level of self-awareness.
It's like, how often do we actually stop and ask ourselves, wait, what am I actually feeling right now?
Right.
We might know something feels off, but do we ever really try to get specific?
It's like having a ton of apps running in the background of your phone. You know, they're just draining your battery even if you're not actively using them. Emotions kind of work the same way. They're always there under the surface, and they can just eat up our energy without us even realizing it.
So emotional awareness is like checking your phone's task manager to see what's eating up all your battery life. I'm starting to see why this is a superpower.
Yeah.
But how do we even begin to figure out what's going on in our own heads? Like, where do we even start?
One of the most powerful things you can do is just learn to identify your emotions accurately. Like just putting a name to what you're feeling can actually help you tame it.
Okay, name it to tame it. I like that.
Yeah.
But how do we go beyond just like, I feel good or I feel bad?
Yeah.
Like, how do we actually get specific with it?
Think of it this way. If you only had 2 apps on your phone, it'd be pretty easy to figure out which one's causing problems. But we have this whole range of emotions and they can get all mixed up. So instead of just saying good or bad, try being more specific. Are you happy, excited, content, or maybe sad,
Anxious?
frustrated?
So instead of just saying, I'm stressed, I could say, I'm feeling overwhelmed because I have 3 exams this week. That does feel a bit less intense.
Exactly. By being specific, you start to understand the root of that feeling, and that gives you more control over how you react.
Gotcha. So step 1, we got to get really clear on what we're actually feeling. What's next?
Well, once you've identified the emotion, it can be helpful to try and understand why you're feeling it. What triggered this feeling? What thoughts are coming up with it? Sometimes just understanding the why can take away some of its power.
Right.
Like if I realize I'm snapping at my roommate because I'm anxious about a presentation at work tomorrow, and not because they didn't do the dishes, makes sense. But sometimes figuring out the why feels impossible. You know? It's just like this big jumble of feelings. It definitely can be tricky. Our emotions aren't always logical, and sometimes we don't have immediate access to the why. But our bodies often give us clues before our minds fully catch up.
Like how I get butterflies in my stomach when I'm nervous.
Exactly. Or a tight chest when you're anxious. Or a lump in your throat when you're sad. Those physical sensations are your body's way of saying, hey, pay attention, something's up.
Okay, so our bodies are trying to give us hints all the time. I need to get better at listening to mine. What can I do to actually start paying attention to those signals?
One thing that can be incredibly helpful is to simply pause and tune in to your physical sensations throughout the day. Just take a few moments to notice what's happening in your body. Are your muscles tense? Is your heart racing? Is your stomach doing flips? Just noticing those sensations can give you a lot of insight into your emotional state.
So I'm starting to see that understanding our emotions is kind of like learning a new language, the language of our inner world.
I love that analogy. And just like learning any new language, it takes practice. The more we pay attention to our emotions, the more fluent we become in understanding their messages.
This has been so eye-opening already. I feel like I'm finally starting to understand why everyone's been talking about emotional intelligence lately. It really is like a superpower. But before we move on, I'm curious, we've talked about tuning into our physical sensations, but are there any other ways to get better at recognizing our emotions?
Absolutely. Another powerful technique is journaling. It's like having a personal conversation with your emotions. Just take a few minutes each day to write down what you're feeling, why you think you're feeling it, and what might have triggered those emotions. Doing that can actually reveal patterns you might not have noticed otherwise.
So it's like turning my thoughts and feelings into data points that I can actually analyze. I love that. It's like having an emotional roadmap.
Exactly. And once you have that roadmap, you can start to navigate your emotions more effectively.
This is all making so much sense. But before we jump into the how-to of actually managing these feelings, I'm curious, you mentioned that emotional awareness is a journey, not a destination. What are some common traps or roadblocks we might encounter along the way?
That's a great question. And it's something we'll explore in more depth in part 2 of our deep dive. We'll dive into common mistakes people make when it comes to understanding their emotions and some strategies for navigating those challenges.
All right, listeners, we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back with part 2, where we'll uncover even more secrets of your emotional superpower. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to the deep dive. Before the break, we were talking about the power of naming and understanding our emotions. It's like we're starting to decode this secret language that our inner world is speaking.
I'm ready to become fluent. But you mentioned there can be some roadblocks, What are some of those common traps we might fall into when we're trying to understand our emotions?
One of the biggest ones is something called emotional suppression. It's basically when we try to bottle up or ignore the feelings we don't like. Think of it like shoving all those clothes you don't want to deal with into the back of your closet and hoping they'll magically disappear. They don't, do they?
Definitely not.
Yeah.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah.
Until you need to find something and it all comes tumbling out. So what happens when we try to suppress our emotions? Do they actually go away?
Unfortunately, no. It's kind of like trying to hold a beach ball underwater. It takes a lot of energy, and eventually it's going to pop up, sometimes in ways we totally don't expect. Those bottled up emotions can show up as increased stress, anxiety, problems focusing, even physical things like headaches or stomach problems.
So ignoring our emotions doesn't make them go away. It's like they just build up and explode later.
What else should we watch out for? Another common trap is something called over-identifying with our emotions. This is when we let our feelings completely define who we are. Like instead of saying, I'm feeling sad, we might say, I am sad. It's subtle, but it can make a huge difference in how we actually experience those feelings.
So it's like getting caught up in the emotion and letting it become our whole identity.
Exactly. We got to remember that feelings are like waves. They rise up, they crest, and then they subside. We can choose to ride that wave, or we can let it completely crash over us and drag us under.
So we can acknowledge the feeling without letting it consume us. But what about those really intense emotions? The ones that feel like they're going to totally swallow us whole. How do we handle those without either suppressing them or getting swept away?
That's where those emotional regulation skills come in. It's not about pretending those big feelings aren't there. It's about learning how to manage them so they don't control us. And that's where those tools we were talking about before come in handy.
Right. The mood tracking, the journaling, even just taking a minute to notice those physical sensations. Are there any other techniques that can help us ride those big waves?
Absolutely. One of the simplest but most effective is mindfulness. It's all about bringing your attention to the present moment without judgment, like hitting that pause button on the mental chaos and just giving yourself a moment to just be.
Mindfulness, I've heard so much about it, but I'm still not sure I totally get it. What does that actually look like?
Yeah.
In real life?
It can be as simple as just taking a few deep breaths and noticing the feeling of your breath coming in and out, or paying attention to the sounds around you, or the feeling of your feet on the ground. It's about grounding yourself in the present moment and creating a little space between you and how intense your emotions are.
So it's not about emptying our minds or trying to force ourselves to feel happy. It's about acknowledging what has it without judging it.
Exactly. It's about creating the sense of awareness and acceptance, even when things feel really difficult. And the more we practice mindfulness, the more we build up that mental muscle of emotional regulation.
It's like we're training our minds to become more resilient and flexible. But what if mindfulness just isn't our thing? Are there other strategies we can try?
Of course. Everyone's different, and what works for one person might not work for another. It's all about finding what works for you and building your own personal emotional toolkit.
I love that idea, an emotional toolkit. So besides mindfulness, what else can we put in our toolkit?
Well, think about the things that always make you feel better. It could be listening to music, spending time in nature, talking to a friend, making art, exercising, anything that helps you unwind and shift your energy.
Okay, so we're starting to build a toolbox full of strategies to help us manage our emotions. But we've been talking a lot about individual emotions. Is it possible to feel multiple emotions at the same time? Like, can we be happy and sad at the same time?
Totally. It's actually super common to feel a whole mix of emotions, especially when we're dealing with complex situations. Think of it like a smoothie. You can mix a bunch of different fruits together and still have a delicious drink. Emotions are kind of similar.
So I could be excited about a new job, but also nervous about the challenges it might bring.
Exactly. Or you could be feeling proud of yourself for reaching a goal, but also a little sad that it's over. It's all just part of being human, and it's totally okay to embrace how complex those feelings can be.
This is making me realize that understanding our emotions is a lifelong journey. There's always more to learn and explore, but we are getting close to the end of part 2 of our deep dive. Before we jump into part 3, I want to make sure we bring all of this back to the real world. We've talked about understanding and managing our own emotions, but how does all of this play out in our relationships with others?
That's a great question, and one we'll definitely dig into more in part 3. After all, we don't exist in a vacuum. Our relationships are a huge part of our emotional world.
So how can we use this newfound emotional awareness to build stronger and healthier relationships?
That's what we're going to unpack in part 3. We'll be back after a short break.
We're back for the final part of our deep dive into your emotional superpower. We've talked about understanding our own emotions, like how to manage them, but I want to know how all this emotional intelligence stuff affects our relationships.
That's a great question. Our relationships are seriously like the backbone of our lives. And you're so right, emotional intelligence isn't just about what's going on inside our heads, it's about how we connect with the people around us.
Okay, so how does understanding our own emotions help us with our relationships?
Well, have you ever noticed when you're super stressed or just overwhelmed, you're way more likely to snap at your friends or fam?
Yeah, totally. I have zero patience and everything's annoying.
Exactly. But when you're feeling more grounded and you're in control of your emotions, you're more likely to be patient, understanding, and just present when you're with other people.
So taking care of our own emotional well-being is like step 1 to having better relationships.
Exactly. It's building that foundation.
Yeah.
And once we have that, we can start adding more emotional intelligence skills on top of it, like empathy.
Empathy. Okay, I hear that word all the time. But what does it actually mean when we're talking about relationships?
Empathy is all about being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes and try to understand their feelings. Even if you don't agree with them, it's about seeing things from their perspective and connecting on an emotional level.
That sounds hard, though, especially when someone's upset or mad. Do you actually practice empathy in those moments?
It starts with really listening, not just waiting to talk, but truly hearing what they're saying and trying to understand the emotions behind their words.
So it's like being an emotion detective, trying to figure out what's really going on.
I love that. It's about being curious, being compassionate, asking questions like, what's making you feel this way? Or help me understand why this is so important to you.
Okay, so empathy is about listening and understanding. What about communication? Does emotional intelligence help with how we talk to people?
For sure. Emotional intelligence helps us communicate more honestly and effectively. When we're in touch with our own emotions, we can talk about them in a way that's clear, respectful, and constructive.
Yeah, but what about when you're scared to say what you're really feeling, like when you're worried about hurting someone or starting a fight?
It's normal to want to avoid conflict, but remember those overflowing closets. Holding back our feelings usually just makes things worse later on. It's all about finding that balance between honesty and being sensitive to how the other person might feel.
So how do we express our emotions without all that drama?
Start with being mindful of how you sound and what words you choose. I statements can really help. Instead of, you always make me feel, try, I feel when.
That makes sense. It's about owning our feelings without blaming the other person.
Exactly. And remember, communication goes both ways. It's not just about us talking about our feelings, but also being open to hearing their side of things.
Okay, we've talked about empathy, communication. What about conflict? Does emotional intelligence help us deal with disagreements?
Definitely. Emotional intelligence helps us approach those arguments with a more balanced and chill mindset. Instead of getting defensive or letting things escalate, we can step back, note what we're feeling, and choose a response that reflects our values.
So, like staying calm when things get heated.
It's not always easy, but it's a skill worth learning. And remember those mindfulness techniques, super helpful when you're in those tough situations.
Right. Just taking a few deep breaths before responding can totally change the whole vibe. It's like giving yourself a little time out.
Exactly. You can think things through instead of just reacting.
Okay, this is all making so much sense. I'm really seeing how emotional intelligence is like a superpower for relationships. But before we wrap up, what about boundaries? How do those fit in?
Boundaries are crucial for any healthy relationship. They're how we protect ourselves and make sure our needs are being met. And guess what? Emotional awareness is super important for setting those boundaries.
Wait, how so?
When you're in tune with your emotions, you're more likely to realize when someone's crossed the line or when something starts to feel icky or draining,
So it's like our emotions are sending us signals like red flags that something's off.
Exactly. When we pay attention to those signals, we can stand up for ourselves and keep from getting hurt.
This has been such a great deep dive into the world of emotional intelligence. We've gone from figuring out our feelings to managing them to understanding how they affect our relationships.
And we've only scratched the surface. There's always more to discover about this amazing part of being human.
To all our listeners, we hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into your emotional superpower. Remember, your emotions are on your team. Learn to understand them and work with them, and you'll open up so many possibilities for yourself and your relationships.
Keep practicing mindfulness. Keep those lines of communication open, and keep exploring the amazing power you have inside.
And that's a wrap on our deep dive into your emotional superpower. Until next time, stay curious and keep on diving.